don't want to start off on a negative note. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the bigger landscape of institutions and mechanisms that are involved in this. And my colleagues, Jennifer is going to talk more about the role of civil society organizations and NGOs.
What I'm going to talk about is the potentially debilitating role of intermediary organizations for citizen empowerment. And I have found in my research that these kinds of dynamics occur in the United States with community-based organizations domestically. They occur in developing countries, and they also occur in global public policy processes. So these are really endemic challenges that I think we need to think about, and especially in the context of teaching in public administration, because a lot of our students become professionals working in intermediary organizations. So I think it's imperative that they understand what these challenges and what these risks are. So I want to make briefly 2 points. First is on the need to carefully teach the trade-offs involved in citizen empowerment. And second, to teach and promote analyses of motivations, tacit and otherwise. And I'll follow these with a brief illustration. Sure. So first of all, on the need to teach the trade-offs. The first trade-off I wanted to talk about is one that I think we're all very familiar with, which is the trade-off between efficiency and effectiveness. We all know how messy participation can be, and civic engagement, any stakeholder participation, takes a lot more time. But it's the only way to engender the ownership necessary to sustain results, which is how we should be defining effectiveness, right? So there's also a time dimension to this. You invest for longer-term outcomes. The rush for immediate and short-term results, efficiency, comes at great cost for that long-term effectiveness. And I think we've all experienced that this isn't just true in terms of the broader governance systems, but also within organization change processes. And we're experiencing some of that at our university right now. A second trade-off is empowerment versus material outcomes. So related to the other trade-off, material outcomes can be achieved much more quickly and efficiently without any empowerment at all, minimum empowerment, or lip service to empowerment. And this is not as straightforward as it may seem. In our rush to help citizens obtain the material outcomes they seek, we may intervene with technical assistance because we want to be helpful. And this is the risk in our teaching, is that students understand that we may be well-intended and we want to rush in with that technical assistance to help them achieve what they say they want. But this kind of technical assistance may actually be really harmful. And Terry Cooper documents in a really beautiful case study based right here in Los Angeles. It's an older article, but it looks at how intervening with technical assistance and training people who can be interlocutors between citizens and power structures can actually do long-term damage, because our technical assistance sometimes brings citizens closer to those power structures where they begin to speak the language and assume the culture of those power structures, and they lose their credibility and efficacy in representing local citizens. So this is a real danger that I think we face a lot in our governance interventions. The final trade-off that I wanted to briefly mention is equal participation versus meaningful participation and representation. That y'all come can serve to reinforce existing power relations, drowning out those who are most in need of empowerment, or can just create a lot of noise without progress. And I think we've seen this a lot in our society here, right, in the media, when we give equal voice to all constituencies because we think that's the democratic way to go, when in fact what we're doing is we're lending validation to voices that are not very representative and may be quite destructive to our communal aims. So I think this is a really important trade-off that we need to sensitize our students to. And I have found in my own teaching, and maybe you have as well, that it's almost a gut reaction among students that when they think about what is fair and democratic, they always default to some kind of equal participation without a more nuanced assessment, such as a political economy analysis, that would tell them that not all voices are equal, right? So now I'd like to switch gears to the second major issue I wanted to discuss, which is the motivations of intermediaries and interveners. So first of all, we're all familiar with accountability to funders being in tension with what may be good for democratization and citizen empowerment. And some of this also comes from just wanting to abide by the community of practice norms. And so what that means is that there's a tendency to emphasize efficiency, predetermined time frames, such as logical frameworks, and quick results, right? So these are not new challenges, but we could give more attention in our teaching to how these accountability orientations lead to the kind of well-intended technical assistance that can result in what I just described, the distancing of interlocutors from their own constituencies. Do citizens need to be professionalized in order to be empowered? This is a really important question that I think we need to teach to. So the second issue is organizational survival and not problem solution. So looking at the motivations of our interveners, many intermediaries depend vitally on the continuing needs of those they serve. Organizational survival, right? So there's no incentive to empower them and then walk away. I'd like to, I hope I have time for a brief illustration, maybe? Okay, very quickly. Okay, so I wanted to share just briefly some of my experiences participating in the global forums on migration and development in their civil society days, where a lot of these kinds of dynamics came up. And one of the big ones was that their definition of civil society included academics, which is why I got to be there, but also business interests, because it was anything non-governmental. You put all those folks in a room and you say, what should be the priorities for these dialogues, and you're going to have unequal voices and a lot of noise. So there was never a feeling that the policy recommendations, I'm going to sneeze. Oh, okay, maybe not. There was never any feeling that the policy recommendations really represented the will of any one constituency. So that was a huge issue. And the second thing that happened that was quite distressing to me was when you're dealing with issues as significant as migration. And it is a very complex topic, and there are a lot of different perspectives and constituencies, but you end up, I didn't realize, having these really severe conflicts between people who look at migration through a refugee lens and those who look at migration, as I did, as kind of a diaspora lens. So if you think about it, those are two fundamentally different perspectives on how we define our citizens, if you will. One is the refugee victim, the other is the empowered migrant who wants to make a difference where they live and where they came from. And those two constituencies fought quite a lot precisely because the refugee-serving organizations would be out of a job if they were not able to continue to emphasize the needs and the helplessness of the people that they were serving. So I'll stop there. Thank you for your indulgence.
Okay. So I'm going to focus on the second part of the title of our session, which is Bridging Research, Pedagogy, and Practice. And I think we all confront silos in our professional lives between practitioners and academics, between our disciplines, between research methodologies, between sectors, particularly in international development, and between research and teaching. And I've spent my career basically with a foot in the world of practice and the other foot in academia. So I'm going to talk briefly about transferring some of the work that I've been doing in terms of civic engagement on social accountability into the classroom. And the argument on the policy research side is that social accountability has become one of these faddish solutions to citizen engagement problems. And from a methodological perspective, randomized controlled trials have been the way that a lot of research on this has taken place. And some of you may have seen the news that Esther Duflo and her husband won the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work at the Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And she's known as the queen of the randomistas in the international development world. So Paul mentioned the importance of context, and I think particularly focusing on how to contextualize citizen engagement, and in the social accountability realm, focusing on how citizens interact with the state and what are the features that have an impact on how effective they can be at engaging with providers and policymakers and all. So one of the pieces of research that I did came out in Public Administration Review in 2016, and it's open access, so anybody can download it if you're interested. And what we did in that study was to look at the instrumental aims of social accountability around improving the delivery of goods and services, improving governance and democracy, and increasing citizen empowerment, and looked at four cases, one in Indonesia, one in the Philippines, one in Guinea, and one in Rwanda. And I don't really have time to go into the findings, but basically we looked at ways of explaining the outcomes across the four cases and found that very much the structure of government and the processes that government uses mediate the effectiveness of social accountability, and that active state support to engaging citizens is important, but it's no guarantee that it's actually going to work. And Jennifer mentioned this idea about sort of professionalized citizens, and I think that's also something that applies in these cases. Decentralization can create space for doing these things, but the upward accountability often is limited when you've got links between local government and national. So let me focus on transferring some of that to the classroom. So I think that some of those siloed aspects also apply to our students. I find in particularly, I teach a course on nonprofits in international development, and I find that my students have a very strong normative preference for citizen participation and empowerment, and think it's sort of an unmitigated good no matter what. And so I think that often the ability of students to engage with research findings that suggest nuance, context, and those kinds of things, it's difficult for them to grapple with the practical applications of that sort of understanding. I find they're often they're looking for, well, when is participation going to be best in all cases? And so the course that I teach really tries to get people to look at trade-offs, balances between one set of choices and the other. But I think also because students live in the same silos that we do, having them hear that message can be difficult. In my class, I usually have a mix of people from international development programs, public policy, public administration, and then a smattering of people from sector programs, health, education, and all. So I think the emphasis on trying to get people to understand the nuance, the way that I try to do that is to have many cases and engagement around practical applications of these things in the classroom. And I think that's really the best way to figure out how to translate research findings into practical work-related competencies that students can come away from the class knowing something practical as well as something academic. And I think there's really a wide variety of ways to do that. Before this panel, I did a quick Google search of syllabi, and Paul and John's, yours popped up as one. Your sort of intro course to international development, and there's a module in there on that. I must say that the level of work you ask of them, I'm impressed. I wonder whether they actually read all that stuff. But anyhow, so I think there are lots of different ways, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that in terms of your own teaching, about how to engage students in practical efforts to get them to grapple with concepts and then apply that in some practical way. Another course that popped up was the one that Terry Cooper, who is just stepping down from a long distinguished career at USC, did around civic engagement, and he's very well known for the work that he's done in Los Angeles over decades, which is sort of a wonderful legacy of research. So I will stop there. I see you're about ready to wave the card here, Paul, and happy to answer other questions and comments in the Q&A. So over to you, Lois.
Great. And first of all, I want to thank Paul for putting us together, because I never see him, and it's so great to see you in person in 3 dimensions. It's great. And welcome to you all to Los Angeles. There's a great shakeout at 10:17, so we may all be diving under the table. And, Southern California Edison may be turning off our power, so welcome to Los Angeles. I'm going to talk a little bit about research that we've done in Thailand and Vietnam, specifically about how to measure social capital, which was a big deal back in the 90s, I guess, but, and how we use that to think through how you engage in research in a collective fashion, but also how these lessons may translate to NASPAA schools and programs, thinking about some of these issues that we've already heard about today. So when you do these projects, as you all know, hopefully the best projects come together from various different disciplines. So I've worked a long time with Rita Denier from the University of Toronto and Jeffrey Carpenter in Middlebury College, and we came together to kind of figure out how do you measure social capital, trust, and reciprocity in a rigorous fashion. So we were particularly interested in how collective action, social capital, trust, and civic engagement affected delivery of water, sanitation, and solid waste in tenure-insecure enclaves in these 2 cities. So we conducted interview surveys, typical stuff, and then we brought Jeffrey Carpenter on board our team because he was doing some really interesting experimental games in the 90s in South America. So we thought, he's a nice guy. So we thought, okay, we'll work together and we'll try to figure out how to do this in Southeast Asia. So yeah, it's old stuff, but maybe still useful, I don't know. I know, or I think, that we're all kind of familiar with interviews and surveys, so let me just talk a little bit about experimental games for those of you who haven't done them before, because they're kind of interesting. They're drawn from behavioral economics. They think about how you sort of measure in a scenario fashion how people are actually going to behave in real life, although for them it was real life because there was real money involved. So we recruited individuals from 5 enclaves in Bangkok and Ho Chi Minh City. These are tenure insecure folks. They don't own property, slums, whatever you want to call them. We'd worked in these same 5 enclaves in Bangkok for the previous 2 or 3 years. And then we were working in Ho Chi Minh City for the previous year. So we came in after that in the same 5 enclaves in 2 cities to run these experimental games. So basically, experimental games are sort of this scenario approach that allow you to measure sort of behavior over rounds, which simulates time, perhaps relationship building, but behavior, because they're dealing with real cash. And in this case, in these tenure insecure settlements, cash is important. So we made sure, just as a forefront to some of the lessons later on, that they were guaranteed a full day's wages or revenues at the end of this day, because they're making a trade-off between participating in our study and being able to earn money to feed their families. So we wanted to make sure that they weren't having to give up something to work with us. The second thing is, of course, that you go over a number of rounds, and so people learn stuff as they go over these number of rounds. They're not allowed to speak to each other in these groups. In these 5 enclaves, I should mention, we were trying to look at gender differences as well. So one of the groups, so we had 5 enclaves. So one group was mixed gender. 2 groups were all men, and 2 groups were all women. And so there were 10 enclaves total in these 2 cities. And they were told that, so you go behind, basically practices, you're given some money at the beginning. You go behind a screen. There is a collective fund that the research assistant has, and you're told as a participant that you can give some, all, or none of your money to the collective pot. And at the end of this whole thing, the end of each round, they will double the size of the pot and distribute the cash in the pot equally amongst all participants. And so we had like between 4 and 7 people. And it's not a lot of money, so we're not talking about, escalating millions of dollars, whatever your geometric progression is. It wasn't like that. It's sort of small amounts of money. So they would go behind the screen. They would not talk to each other between rounds. And at the end, of course, we hopefully will have learned something about how they behaved about collective endeavors like infrastructure. In the United States, when they run these experimental games, as you might well imagine, for those of you who teach microeconomics, or any kind of introductory class, students learn over time that they can be free riders really easily because there's no sanctions for your behavior. So they go behind the screen, they get money, and then they figure out, I don't have to give any money, and I still get some money out of the collective pot. So when you look at rounds in the United States, the trend line is always downward. Every single, I think, experiment turns out that way in the United States. In our Southeast Asian 10 enclaves, the trend line was the exact opposite. They all went up, and they all went up mixed gender groups, male groups, female groups, in both cities. So we had all kinds of different explanations for why that happened. But I think here are some 3 lessons to take away from all of this. First is that relationships need to be mutually beneficial. So as you might well imagine, when you're giving money in and you're getting a bunch of money back, people are seeing that their individual contributions are actually having some impact because it's a collective endeavor. So yes, it's an experiment. Yes, there's scenarios, but we did see that, that's the exact opposite trend line as we saw in the United States. So there's that. So if they can see the material benefits of participating, maybe there's something there to think about as you move forward on some of your own plans. We also, in the development and implementation of the study itself, we made sure that our partners were funded. They got co-authors, we all co-authored together, so that this was about a co-production of knowledge, so that we were trying to make sure that we were practicing what we were trying to preach, that we were engaging in a civic engagement collective sort of endeavor that was co-producing, as I mentioned, knowledge. And as I mentioned before, that we made sure that these folks knew at the forefront that they were not giving up revenue-generating opportunities to help us with our study. The second point I want to make is that trust and reciprocity take time and commitment. So you're mentioning Tara Cooper. Obviously, 10 rounds is not sort of a lot of time and commitment, but it does represent sort of in experimental fashion a bunch of stuff that's going on. So it's sort of representing a bunch of time in between things that are happening. Although in these experimental games, you're not allowed to talk to one another. So they're not really communicating, but we're just focusing on their individual behavior. And for our research project in general, we didn't just go in cold and expect everybody to drop what they're doing and help us out. So Amrita had worked in Thailand for a whole year prior to our first study when we went in there. So she had established all these relations already. Amrita's a lovely person. People trust her. So we were going in with a bunch of goodwill prior to doing all the crazy stuff we decided to do with surveys and interviews and using up everybody's time. And then the third point I want to make is that good work, civic engagement work requires more than a one-off effort. So I have, and I'm sure many of you have gone into places that somebody else mucked up the waters and you had to go clean it all up and reestablish trusting relationships with people and tell them that researchers are not all bad people, we're not all, exploitative folks. And so part of the issue here is that we had worked in these 5 enclaves over a number of years. They knew who we were working with community leaders, they trusted the university partners we worked with in Bangkok and Ho Chi Minh City. So we were establishing an infrastructure of trust and reciprocity to be able to do this kind of work. And so I think if you're thinking about students, you're thinking about doing your own research, you're thinking about service, whatever it is you're doing, it can't be just a one-time thing. You have to make sure that they understand that you're there for the long term with them to walk the path. I think I'll end there and let you kind of.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Paul, and to the panel. There have been lots of great ideas raised and a lot to think about. I would like to talk a little bit about a domain, I think, of civic engagement that gets less emphasis, particularly in the context of the SDGs, where I think the dominance in the literature is really about citizens engaging with the state, either at the local level or the national level, and talk about global value chains. It's the topic of the most recent World Development Report, and increasingly where much of the world's trade, production, and consumption occurs is through global value chains, and how to think about that. I'm going to emphasize on the pedagogy side of our tripartite division of research, pedagogy, and practice. So I teach a field research course in Ghana that is focused on food security and global value chains. And the dominant research project that each student has is to take one of 6 staple commodity crops and do secondary research while they're in the US. And then we spend 3 weeks traveling around Ghana and along with translators in 3 of the main regions. The students are doing field interviews about the particular value chain that they're investigating. One of the things that I find very difficult for particularly our US students, trying to talk about context and nuance and the vagaries of working in intermediary organizations is very difficult, I think, to effectively communicate that in a classroom setting, as many of readings by James Ferguson or others that we can provide to people, to give them a sense of how kind of well-intentioned technocracy can actually undermine efforts at community engagement and empowerment. There's nothing like throwing them into the field and talking to people about their direct experiences of being helped by intermediate organizations to try to communicate some of the trade-offs that Jennifer was talking about earlier. And so we match this work in terms of the field research course with looks at other examples of campaigns that have been focused on trying to develop citizen engagement or civic engagement to alter the distribution of costs and benefits in global value chains. One of the key comparative cases that we use is the experience of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in the United States, which has pioneered kind of worker-driven social responsibility, corporate social responsibility efforts that originally started in the tomato fields of Florida, and now has expanded to the garment industry in Lesotho, among others, to try to look at what are the ways that we can think about understanding the dimensions of nuance and so forth that Derek was speaking about, but also identify what might be potential transferable lessons, that elements of which may be able to travel to other kinds of situations and contexts. And so far, the student experience, we've been doing this now for almost 10 years, and the student experience seems to be, or response actually, seems to be very positive. And the third element that we look at is particularly fair trade as one of the direct interventions that's aiming to address some of the elements of the Sustainable Development Goals, even though, of course, fair trade existed long before the SDGs were a figment of someone's imagination. And we use Ghana again because one of the only fair trade chocolate companies where cocoa farmers actually have an equity stake in the chocolate company is Divine Chocolate from Ghana, and use that again as a direct case study in terms of interviewing cocoa farmers and the folks who are the intermediaries of the Union of Cocoa Farmers that are the architects of the Fair Trade Agreement, to try to understand what are actually the opportunities and challenges of a participatory, citizen engagement driven effort to alter the distribution of costs and benefits within, in this case, a Western consumer global value chain. And I think this is a space that remains kind of underemphasized as a domain of research in terms of really thinking about the broad scope of opportunities for civic engagement that would fundamentally address some of the key challenges laid out in the SDGs. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. Well, thanks to everybody for keeping time. We've actually got, unusually for this group, we have a good block of time for other people to talk. So I was including myself in that. I wasn't just. There's obviously been quite a range of issues around citizen engagement that have been laid out with both very specific and implied considerations related to research and pedagogy. So I think that we can just leave it open to whatever comments and questions people might want to have. I think what we should do, because we do only have about 20 minutes, maybe take a few questions at a time, and then if you are directing your question to a specific person, we can note that, but otherwise we'll just sort of leave it up to the panel to determine who might respond. And if you don't have a question but just want to make a comment or relate an experience, that's fine too.
So I went to the session, and I have not used any of the Batten simulations that were the feature of the workshop yesterday, but I have used other simulations, the ICON simulation from the University of Maryland, the MIT ones on global climate and fish banks, and the African Farmer 2.0 simulation, which kind of is a household level decision-making kind of simulation. The last one has the least element of citizen engagement to it because there's no real bargaining associated with it. It's kind of, except for the intra-household bargaining, but it's not broader bargaining. The others I find very useful. I think it's, the strengths and limits of simulations. How much do you have to oversimplify a situation, and how quickly do students learn how to game the simulation, which I think is actually an instructive process, because you can take that and say, so now let's think about these performance measurement systems and how similar it is to this particular game, and how it focuses your attention on what the kind of key things that you're trying to be measured on, as opposed to perhaps the ultimate outcomes you're trying to achieve. When student feedback is often very robust, that they enjoy these kinds of sessions and so forth, I don't have any good research to be able to identify, how is this actually a skill building exercise and that sustains itself, so forth. Impressionistically, it seems like people do kind of try then to think about, particularly if they're young undergraduates without any kind of lived experience in the professional world. Okay, how do I have to think about building coalitions if I'm starting from a position of weakness? Or how do I really obtain credible commitments from someone if I'm in a bargaining situation? But I don't really have a good,
I'll just say that part of the reason why we went to experimental games is that it's very difficult to measure trust and reciprocity, because everybody says, oh yeah, I love everybody in my neighborhood, or oh yeah, if I had a problem, I could talk to 10 people, when in fact, that's not really true. So we were trying to figure out ways to assess collective action. Now, did these people learn anything about collective action as a result of participating in the study? I don't think so. I mean, we went back and talked about, oh, look like you all want to do collective action. No, they don't. I mean, it measured the potential. The real lesson for us is that it measured the potential for collective action given obvious individual benefit. So when we left, we thought, you know what, it can't just be about, you need to do the right thing, you need to come out and do something for your neighbors. It was really about, you know what, if I can see that something is going to benefit me because I do this thing, and I don't have to do everything, but I can do a little piece, sure, I'll do that. So if you can get that lesson to your students, maybe they get it, but it's more that they're having fun and you're studying them. So anyway.
No, I was just going to say, and how do you get people to think about how to use that information beyond? And I think that's the hard thing. But I mean, I will say that I think that you maybe do lose some of the nuance in doing this type of an exercise as opposed to teaching a really detailed case. But on the other hand, when you teach a really detailed case and you try to have a conversation with the students, you often realize that they don't get the nuance. And so, I'm not sure that I think that having people involved in this way creates at least some thinking space for people that's different than more traditional ways of delivery.
Well, I used to teach a development management course. I had taught the same course for 25 years, so I decided it was time to pass it on to some fresh thinking. But it was kind of like a mini capstone, and I think that's where you can get at a lot of these things. So I think we all recognize our students learn a lot of the theories and hopefully skills along the way in their curriculum, but a really well-designed capstone course or a practicum like this development management course I taught is designed to pull it all together. And in the particular class that I taught, we worked with client organizations to actually articulate a project design. So when you are working with teams of students, you can teach a lot of this through a Socratic method because they have a real-life project working with a real-life client. And if they're kind of going down that overly directive path, you can begin to ask them questions. Well, what impact do you think that's going to have on the citizens? Or gosh, if you do that, do you think that's going to be sustainable? So having that's another way of bringing in, it's a little bit like a simulation. Some of the projects that the students designed for clients were actually implemented, which was quite exciting, but often they weren't. But at least they had real situations that they could be working in. And often the host at the client organization was doing the same thing I was on the other side. So they were getting it kind of in stereo from a practitioner's perspective and a academic perspective. So that's one thing. If you can challenge students to think about how would you design something that is trying to achieve X, right?
And I think there are scaled down versions of that. I mean, I've done a lot of this kind of work, taken time off and worked in other countries on designing projects and things like that. And I sometimes take, based on actual cases that I was involved in for years, develop something just like an in-classroom exercise where you ask people, here's a bunch of context, here's something you're trying to do, whether it's setting up a civic engagement mechanism or something else, improving delivery of a public service, and here are some parameters, what would you do with this? And then of course, inevitably what happens is that people have a hard time because they don't know the context, understanding the relevance of the context for this, and they tend to fall back on the textbook principles, like this is what, or they think about some situation that they were in and they fall back on what happened in a similar situation if they're slightly older, more experienced students and things like that. And so then we do these things and people come back and we look at their often very diverse answers and we discuss, I tell them what actually happened and why all their answers were impossible for various reasons of context and economic, political realities that they weren't thinking of. So it also is simplifying, it's kind of dumbing down what actually happened, but at least it makes them think, oh yeah, there are other things that I'm not used to thinking about, that if I'm going to make this participatory process or whatever work, I need to think about those things. I think that can be very helpful.
Well, I'd say what's happened in my classes is I've had a lot of students who bring that experience and interest to the classroom. And so it sort of emerges that way. And I've had some really interesting discussions generated by the students themselves. The class that I teach is a mid-level graduate course. And I'd say my students on average have anywhere from 1 to 7 years of work experience, some of it overseas, the usual smattering of returned Peace Corps volunteers and others. So it really often emerges from the discussion within the class and then people learning from each other. And it actually works quite well. I mean, I do focus on gender as a topic in managing nonprofits, both because that ends up being a lot of the programs that nonprofits support, but also within individual nonprofits. The staff and volunteers often have different sexual orientations. And so thinking about how do you manage that?
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that, and this could be a reflection of being in Washington, D.C. or any major urban environment, the students themselves create safe space for each other, because most of our students, they don't really think about those differences as such a big deal. And again, I think that may reflect being in an urban, environment, and that you wouldn't find that everywhere in the United States or everywhere in the world for sure. But these younger generations, I feel so old saying that, they're so much more open and accepting of anybody, and I'm just delighted that they bring that into the classroom, so you can have these open conversations and really learn from them, and they learn from each other.
Are you bringing any case studies for pedagogy in so that the students aren't the ones creating these spaces?
Well, so maybe I can comment on this a little bit, and Stacy will know about this, being the CHISI, one of the incoming officers at the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. So one of the things that we've tried to do at this other association is to try to make sure that there are places where people can learn about having difficult conversations. I mean, I think it's difficult for instructors to manage these sorts of issues when they don't have any training, they may not have any background in this, and then they're seeing tension in the classroom, but they don't really know how to react. So part of what we were doing at ACSP was to try to make sure that we had tools available for people to have the dialogue, first of all. And the first session we had, which was a couple years ago, was a presidential session to show the membership that this was an important issue for the association. It was a very difficult session, I should say. I moderated it. There was a lot of pain in the room. It was standing room only, a lot of anger. We had a very diverse panel. I mean, it was not easy to do. So that's why we all don't want to do it, because it's so hard. But I think from that point on, people understood that, okay, there are ways we can have these conversations so that we don't have to just sort of do it behind the screen or try to figure out that there's somebody who can do it for us. So I think part of the issues is to really create a set of institutional infrastructure support for people to be able to learn how to do this if they're not at an institution where this is already happening, that they can go and see how this may be modeled. But then also to kind of practice what you preach and go do that stuff, you know, and to talk to your colleagues. And it's hard. It's not easy to, I still find it difficult to do. And we did that thing, and it was hard. And then after, people wanted to stay and keep doing it, and I'm like, you know what, I'm tired. I got to go because I need a break, right? Because it was hard. It was emotionally draining to go through that session.
So in terms of cases that you mentioned, so less so in my Ghana course because same-sex sexual acts are criminalized. So we have things that students read in advance, both so they can get an understanding and also to provide students with full information about the ways in which they may act in the United States may not be met with uniform acceptance elsewhere, and so how to think about that. And in my politics of development class, both in the sections on gender and development and on human rights, I use the issue of LGBTQ rights in sub-Saharan Africa particularly as an interesting discourse on the ways in which, what's the appropriate way to advocate for human rights, kind of building off something that Jennifer was raising earlier about, I want to help, therefore I'm going to call for sanctions against Uganda when it's considering passing particular kind of legislation, as opposed to voices of organized LGBTQ individuals in Uganda who are saying, don't reproduce colonialism, you know, act in solidarity with us. You may feel good calling for this, but this is not actually helping our struggle. And so I think trying to problematize those kinds of power relationships helps to raise those broader sets of discussions of kind of.
And I would just like to add that, you know, I didn't mean to sound like too Pollyanna-ish about what happens in the classroom. I think my experience may be unique because of that particular course, because the very first session, it really slaps people in the face, raising questions of, are there universal values? And I do this through a really jarring film about what some call FGM and others call something else, right? So, which already illustrates your values orientation. And then we have a conversation about the, you know, do universal values exist? And if they do, how, you know, with some of the sensitivities that John mentioned. And so, if you frame the class with that kind of framing right from the very first class session, it gives people a different orientation, and I try to reinforce that throughout, where they're constantly thinking about, wait, is this my opinion, or is this a universal thing, and how, you know, so.
My class, as I mentioned, is on managing nonprofits for international development, and one of the requirements is that the students, they have to select among the topics that we cover in the class, and then depending on where that falls in the semester, they have to go interview somebody in an NGO and then come back and do a report out to the rest of the class on what they learned relative to that topic and how that NGO has applied it, and then they write me a memo on that. So that's one way of trying to bring the real world in a relatively limited way. I mean, as you know, I mean, class meets once a week for 2 hours, so there's not a whole lot of time to do stuff. And so that's one way, and then that often then is the springboard to the discussion for that evening as to what the topic is, and then I use that example to bring up some of the key points around the readings. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
I guess my general response is no.
Yeah, there's no best practice.
Yeah, there's no best practice.
Yeah. And I also think that, you know, you were giving all these different options. You could do this, you could do this, you could do this. I think mixing it up is what is going to be most appealing to students, having a combination of all of the above, because we know that different people learn in different ways, they have different preferences, but also you get kind of bored doing the same thing. Like I remember early on in my teaching, I kind of developed this formula. Every class session, we would discuss the material, and then we would have a small group exercise, and then we would debrief, and it got to feel like it was just boring because it was the same thing every week, you know? So having a combination of things, I think, keeps students more alert and interested.
And I think it does, as you said, it does really depend on the mix of the class. And I think the syllabus you saw was for our executive program. And I think you would think that people who are more experienced mid-career professionals they're just going to know a lot more. But you know, some of them work in a police department in New Jersey, and others work in a Ministry of Finance in Botswana. And so you know, their experiences, their understanding, the underlying cultural values and the organizational values and the institutional structures that they're used to working in can be very different. So even in an environment like that, you really have to mix up the cases, and depends, you know, if you've got 100 people in the class, it's a lot harder. If you've got smaller classes, it's a little bit easier to get a sense of who's coming from where and how you might build exercises that would be a useful mix for the group as a whole.
Yeah, and as I started out talking about being in silos, I'm always struck by the extent to which students try to universalize from their own limited experience to sort of everything, and sort of getting them to figure out how to pull in other experience and say, yes, my own experience is one instance of that, but not the full universe. So they're also looking for the best practices too. So that's often, you know, they say, so professor, what's the best answer to this? And I say, the point of the class is that there is not a best answer to this. It's going to be the kind of trade-offs that Jennifer was mentioning. And the nuanced kinds of things, depending on the context, very much like, you know, John's examples there. And John, I'd like to go and take your Ghana class.
I know, me too.
And you know, I think the other problem that we always face is that academics, social scientists are looking for a way to generalize. They want to say under conditions A, B, and C, you do X. And so are practitioners, because they want to have a solution for something to do. And that, I think, is we need that kind of a framework to help us start to understand what to do in a particular situation. But if we fall back on that, we're really doing our students a disservice. I think it's really about, we need a framework because you need an anchor for how to start thinking about difficult problems. But beyond that, if you stick too much to your anchor, it's going to pull you down to the bottom. And I think on that note, we are a little over time, but thank you very much.